In the previous episode we looked at the first part of the First Punic Wars. We will continue in this second part. Battle was brewing, and a battle that would see the defeat of the Carthaginian fleet in an event that would be remembered in history. Numerous events would occur after the events at the Battle of Cape Ecnomus. For one, the Romans would eventually find themselves landing in Africa, their initial goal, where they could go on to attack Carthage. Secondly, the Carthaginians that had been spared in the fighting would retreat, recovering as they readied themselves for what would follow. Back to the battle. The Roman fleet would assume formation and the Carthaginian fleet would do much the same. Hamilcar and Hanno would be present. The fighting and maneuvering would involve a feint on the part of the Carthaginians which would draw some of the Roman ships towards them. The Carthaginians would use this to their advantage. The fighting would go on and would occur via several fronts with the forces having been split. In the fighting numerous ships would be lost on either side as the fighting went on. At some point in time, the Carthaginian center would be forced into a retreat. Many ships on the Carthaginian side would be lost in the fighting that occurred after. At the conclusion of it, the Carthaginians would lose a lot more than what the Romans had lost. Some of Carthage's ships would be sunk while others would be captured. The events here would be followed by other occurrences like the landing in Aspis by the Roman army, and the Roman siege on the city of Attis. A surprise attack by a Carthaginian force would also occur. It saw individuals like Hamilcar and Hasdrubal involved. Tunis would be captured by the Romans, Carthage would seek peace, but Regulus would give harsh terms, so war would continue, and would see several prominent events. Xanthippus would lead a force against the Romans, and win at the Battle of Tunis 255 BC Battle of Tunis. With the preceding events that had occurred at the Battle of Cape Ecnomus that had seen massive losses endured by the Carthaginians in the naval battle that had seen massive forces involved on both sides. The Battle of Tunis would end with an outcome opposite to that which had occurred during the Battle of Cape Ecnomus in that the Carthaginians would be the force to emerge from the fighting victorious. It would see the involvement of several individuals amongst whom were the likes of Marcus Attilius Regulus. He would go on to play a prominent role in the events that would have followed the Battle of Cape Ecnomus. For one, after the events that had occurred, the Romans had continued to make landing in Africa. They would be met by several successes after which Regulus would take the action of moving in the direction of Carthage with forces. Several events would occur in the background including Hamilcar's return and the addition of several other individuals, some of whom included Hasdrubal. The Carthaginian camp would be attacked by the Romans and they would suffer losses. This would be followed by the change in hands of some territory from Carthage to Rome. Included in the territory was Tunis. Events would follow that would find Carthage placed in a difficult position, which would allow Regulus to demand terms of the Carthaginians. Terms which included territorial concessions and the paying of Rome by Carthage. The Carthaginians would opt to continue in their fight given the terms that they had been given. In the fighting that had occurred, a man by the name of Xanthippus would play a significant role, a mercenary who had varied experiences which would come to be an advantage for the Carthaginians. He would initially play a role in training some forces before he moved on to be given control of the army. The army under him would consist of several different individuals with different roles. The Carthaginians would make camp. The Romans would move to be closer to the Carthaginian army. Xanthippus would move to arrange his army, deciding where the different groups would be placed in relation to each other. The Romans would act in a similar way, organizing their forces in a way they thought would work best for them. Eventually fighting would start between the forces, and the Romans would suffer severe losses, some of them to the elephants that were present. Latin allies were amongst the forces that were with the Romans. The Carthaginians would claim victory in the conflicts. Amongst the Roman forces, some would be able to escape to Aspis, yet some others would be captured. Amongst those who were captured was Regulus. A battle would occur in its aftermath that would have bad effects for the Carthaginians and would see them suffer some losses. Calamity and loss would strike the Romans as they lost ships and men in a storm. 254 BC. Recapturing of Agrigentum by the Carthaginians. Attack of Panormus by the Romans. Letas, Salus, Petra, Tyndarus would eventually be under Rome's influence. Loss of ships by the Romans in a storm again. 252 BC. Lilybaeum has a naval expedition sent towards it by the Romans. Selinus and Heraclea Minoa are captured. Thermae and Lipara are also captured. 250 BC. Effort at capturing Panormus by the Carthaginians. The Romans were foraging for food when they were attacked. Commander Lucius Caecilius Metellus would play a significant role in the counter on the Carthaginians. The Carthaginian attack would involve elephants whose use would be limited by tactics the Romans used. The conflict at Panormus would therefore go down as a Roman victory. 249 BC. Roman consuls for that year being Lucius Junius Pullus and Publius Claudius Pulcher, the father of Appius Claudius Pulcher. Lilybaeum is put to siege by the Romans, harbor is blockaded. But Carthaginians are able to supply and support the city. Surprise attack on the Carthaginian fleet is attempted but fails. Also in 249 BC. Roman defeat at Battle of Drepana. Battle of Phoenicia. General period would see major sieges by the Romans on the Carthaginians. By the end the financial state that both powers were was pitiful and the war had cost them many resources. Lilybaeum and Drepana were still held by Carthage. And Rome would build a new fleet, launching an attack which would eventually prove successful against Carthage and resulting in the Battle of Aegates Island. The fleet from the Romans had been funded by the wealthy individuals of Rome, making a plea for peace instead, which led to the Treaty of Lutatius, and concluding the First Punic Wars. 241 BC. We will look at the Battle of Aegates Island. With everything that had occurred in the preceding events, including the momentous Battle of Tunis which had seen the capture of Regulus amidst the involvement of a man called Xanthippus, and which had ended in Roman defeat and Carthaginian triumph amidst fierce fighting. There had also been a series of tragedies that had led to massive losses of Roman ships in storms, which reduced the fleet that would be available to the Romans. 241 BC would see the Battle of Aegates Island which would end in Carthaginian defeat, and would see several individuals involved including Gaius Lutatius Catulus, Quintus Valerius Falto, and Hanno. The battle would see several events occur in its aftermath including the Treaty of Lutatius. In preceding events several territories had changed hands. Sicily was increasingly falling under Roman control and Carthage had ended up losing territory. Some naval conflicts would be won by the Carthaginians, after the losses at sea for the Romans. Enter Hamilcar Barca. Lilybaeum and Drepana remained in Carthage's possession, but a Roman blockade would be effected which would find itself circumvented at different points in time, a huge part of circumventing the blockade of which was played by blockade runners. Several events would occur which would include the capturing of a man called Hannibal the Rhodian, and the building of a fleet by the Romans. Its inspiration being the captured ship of Hannibal the Rhodian. The Romans had repeated what they had done before in using a captured ship as an inspiration for their own fleet, but not exactly. Several things would also occur preceding the battle including the capturing of the harbor of Drepana. The Carthaginians would respond, but their response would take time, and they would meet several challenges. Eventually, the battle would occur involving the individual known as Hanno who would be different to the other Hanno. Roman scouts would be able to see the Carthaginian fleet, and some Roman ships would move closer to the island of Aegusa. The Carthaginians' ships would be met by the Roman ships. Fighting would ensue, many ships would be sunk, many damaged and both sides would suffer losses. A big factor that had come into play would be the maneuverability of the ships for which the Romans would have an edge over the Carthaginians, Carthaginian ships having some heavy loads on board. The Carthaginians would lose several ships in the conflicts, some of them being captured. The Treaty of Lutatius would follow, and the end of the war, with Carthage having conditions they had to meet which involved issues around territory and other things. Several individuals would be important during the wars. One of them would be Marcus Attilius Regulus. Marcus Attilius Regulus would be a Roman individual who would play a role within the Punic Wars, and would be involved in several events over the course of the First Punic Wars. He'd be the Roman consul in the years of 267 and 256 BC, and would gain victories against the Carthaginians at several points in time. He would be involved in the Battle of Cape Ecnomus, a battle that would end in Roman victory, and would also be involved in the Siege of Aspis. 256 BC had seen a battle that would end in Carthaginian defeat in the form of the Battle of Cape Ecnomus and would involve individuals the likes of Marcus Attilius Regulus on the Roman side, and Hanno and Hamilcar on the Carthaginian side. It would see the involvement of several ships, some of which would be sunk by the end of the conflicts amidst the fierce naval fighting that had occurred. and would also see extensive and large numbers of forces come head to head in a battle that would be noted down in history. He would also be involved in several other battles. The Battle of Tunis would be another noteworthy battle. In the fighting that had occurred, a man by the name of Xanthippus would play a significant role. A mercenary who had varied experiences which would come to play an advantage for the Carthaginians, he would initially play a role in training some of the forces before he moved on to be given control of the army. The army under him would consist of several different individuals with different roles. The Carthaginians would make camp, and the Romans would move to be closer to the Carthaginian army. Xanthippus would move to arrange his army, deciding where the different groups would be placed in relation to each other. The Romans would act in a similar way, organizing their forces in a way they thought would work best for them. Eventually, fighting would start between the forces, and the Romans would suffer severe losses, some of them to the elephants that were present. Latin allies would also be present with the Roman forces. The Carthaginians would claim victory in the conflicts. Amongst the Roman forces, some would be able to escape to Aspis, yet some others would be captured. Amongst those who were captured would be Regulus. Regulus would also be involved in making the demands of the Carthaginians that would be rejected. Though the eventual fate of the Carthaginians would remain unchanged in that the Carthaginians would eventually agree to Roman conditions. The conditions the Carthaginians would agree to would be set by the Romans as stated in the Treaty of Lutatius. His son, Marcus, would eventually go on to be consul at some point in time. After the wars, Carthage's foreign troops would rise up against Carthage, and it would come to lose more land, some it including the island of Sardinia. But when they tried to recover Sardinia, they would be stopped in their track by the threat or reignited war from the Romans, and considering the situation they found themselves in, Carthage agreed to back down. This would contribute in their own ways to the feelings of the Carthaginians towards the Romans, which were far from agreeable. Hamilcar Barca, in the intervening time after the First Punic Wars, would undertake several actions that would add to his stock and that of his family, and over that same period Rome would also expand. Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica would come to contribute economically to Rome. But festering tensions between Carthage and Rome would continue. And an event that saw Saguntum besieged would be pivotal to a flare-up of tensions. The Second Punic War was on the horizon and would see many events. Thank you for listening this podcast into the First Punic War. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel for more. Also watch some of our other videos.